and welcome to a very special EWTN Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host, with someone who doesn't need to be introduced, but it's Marcus Grodi. Life from Our Land is his new book from Ignatius Press, The Search for a Simpler Life in a Complex World, and of course well known as the host for many, many years here and the founder of the whole Journey Home television show. Marcus Grodi, it's great to have you stop by the Bookmark studio. You're always so busy working on the journey home. We don't get to see each other as much as we used to, and certainly don't get to have you on our show until you write a book, so I'm happy you wrote this one. Well, let me ask you, Marcus.
I do want to say to the audience who are fans of the Journey Home program, just let them know that you were a very big part of starting that program with the vision of it. And I think at the beginning, we're not sure we realized what an impact it would have.
Exactly.
But that's because of you and Mother Angelica.
And really, Mother Angelica. I mean, Mother was when you were on the show. She saw that, and we helped put some wheels on it, I guess, in that way. And this is great.
Thank you for
that. It's a pleasure. Thank you. I mean, we hear all the time the wonderful stories, and I know you don't hear it probably as much as you probably should. For all of us, sometimes, we're going and doing, and we're so close to the. We don't see the forest through the trees and realize the impact many times people are having until you're out and about maybe sometimes. But Life from Our Land, The Search for a Simpler Life in a Complex World. People may remember way back when, at different times, you might have talked about the fact that you had actually, you weren't necessarily always a farmer, quote unquote. And as you say here, you're really not a farmer even today,
right?
But you play one on television, kind of a thing, right? So what made you? You've written books over the years, kind of journey home stories. You've written 2 novels, basically, that were available for people may remember How Firm a Foundation, and then
Pillar and Bulwark.
Pillar and Bulwark, which was the follow-up, and also Thoughts for the Journey. All of them we had the pleasure of having available through our catalog and being able to talk about it. Now, this one's, it's not, as you say at the very beginning, one would pick it up and think, as you say here in the preface, though this book does include autobiographical snippets, I do not intend to give here a running account of our successes and failures. You have failures? Okay. For that, you can watch old episodes of Green Acres.
Yeah, exactly.
Or peruse the many books and websites. So I was thinking, so you're like the Eddie Albert in this story. Is that really what it was?
He was a better farmer than I am, but.
Well, your wife is just as pretty as Ava Gabor, that I'll say.
I definitely agree with that. She's the better half for sure. But in many ways, this book is the other side of doing the Journey Home all these years, because during the 19 years we've done the Journey Home, what was happening on the other side was this, and that's what this book is about. Right. And I have no farming background, but what happened is my wife inherited land from their century farm, and so I'm an old engineer, so I designed a house. We had it built. We moved out to the woods. I'm thinking Marilyn's going to be living out in this nice house, comfortable rural setting with her family all around her while I'm traveling. That's what.
And that gave you a feeling that it was that way you felt more comfortable if you were out doing work for the Journey Home, for the Coming Home Network.
Yeah, I'm traveling
all the time, right.
Every week.
Doing the show
we're coming down here.
Yeah, and going and giving talks at many conferences and things like that.
Yeah, so it wasn't thinking about farming by any means. And I don't think that I ever had any inkling that this was a calling, or in fact, I joking there that no, it was not farming, it was framing. That's what God was thinking. He wanted me to go into work in an art studio. No. And so, but
you misheard it?
Yeah, I misheard. Actually, what happened as we were there's a barn, and it's across the valley from our house. It's a 100-year-old barn.
Now, was that on your property?
It's on our property. It was there. It was the only thing on the property when we moved there. In fact, the land was so overgrown that when I told the contractor where the driveway in the house, I'm walking in shoulder-length briars with the bulldozer following behind. Here's where we want to go, and we're going down the hill. But that barn was there, built by my wife's grandfather and great-grandfather from wood on our land. And I remember us thinking, well, wait a second, what's that barn for? The man who originally lived on this land, bought it from the state of Ohio back in the early 1800s when it was nothing but a forest. He cleared that land to raise sheep. Her family raised sheep on that land, and I'm thinking, wait a second, there's a purpose here. So we began envisioning, well, God, are you calling us to be a better steward of this land? What's it for? And so in the last 12 years, we've had sheep, we've had Angus cows, we've milked several cows, we've had pigs, we've had horses, we've had
Jersey
chickens.
cows too.
Jersey
right? 'Cause I know
cows,
there's some pictures
absolutely.
here of the Jersey cows.
Love Jersey cows. In fact, I've
Now they're not from New Jersey though, right?
Well, they're
No,
from
no.
the island of Jersey.
Jersey, right?
But it's, in fact, I'm contemplating maybe someday, we'll see. It's got to be a corporate decision between Marilyn and myself. But, maybe a small artesian dairy to make cheese, just as a hobby. We've made cheese.
What kind of cheese would you make if you were making cheese?
Well, there's
there
some
in
cheese that's
Ohio?
easier, farmer's cheese.
Okay.
But most, depending on what kind of milk you're starting with, Jersey, and then depending on how you want to cure it, and then how long you want to store it, and
Right.
whether you're going to add any
I see.
bacteria to get a blue cheese or whatever, it's just more difficult. But I've made cheddar cheese, and
Oh, really?
we would make cottage cheese almost every night. In fact, a Mennonite showed us how to make butter in a blender, cracked us up. The Mennonite teaches us how to make butter
Butter
with
in
a blender.
Yeah.
But it was a good life, and part of that whole period, which many of the times I was essentially the main milker.
Yes.
My boys would help at their age. Marilyn was in the kitchen taking care of all the other good stuff. But there were a couple times when, okay, I've got to leave Monday morning to come here. So I get up early, milk the cow, get on an airplane, and then that night they're taking turns. I remember one time I'm doing a journey home, I forgot to turn my phone off. And it rings like 2 minutes before the program starts, and it's Marilyn saying the cows are out. I'm down here in Birmingham.
Yeah.
So it was good for the boys. They learned a lot. It was part of their discerning what God called. Is God calling them to be on the land, to be back on the farm? And it wasn't their calling. And I've learned, but the other things that we learned in there about the spiritual life, about detachment, about simplicity, many ways that's what the book is more about.
Well, you say here, nor is the book an apologetic for leaving the city for a self-sustaining, off-the-grid, non-electric rural life of farming. And you say, I've entitled the book Life from Our Land because I want to share what we've learned about life and maybe more importantly, what we have discovered about how we ought to be living our lives from having the privilege of living out here on the land.
Right.
And you also say, for years I thought there was nothing new under the sun, but then I started paying attention to the landscape, the geography, and the rhythms around me. It not only awed me, but also helped me to see how God works through creation. I'm a believer. Nature is a great reminder. What is nature a great reminder of to you?
Well, people might think of me as a theologian, which I ain't, or a Bible scholar, which I ain't, or a philosopher. I really ain't, and I use the word ain't on purpose because I don't fit any of those categories. In many ways, I'm more a scientist. More of my training and my heart is in science. And I could talk for hours about that. But what moving to the country reawakened within me is that God gave us this beautiful creation for a purpose. There's a purpose behind it, a teleological thread in that, and that is that it was there to draw our attention to Him. And Bonaventure says it very clearly in his book, Journey in the Mind of God. The first step that Bonaventure said to grow closer to God is to see God's fingerprints in the world around us. And the devil does everything he can to get our attention away from that, even though, and then there are people out there that are into the world, they're into Mother Earth, they're into saving the world, but they're missing the point.
Right.
You know, they're missing the point that tree, that wonderful squirrel, that little bird, all those things are expressions of God's joy.
Yeah, a reflection of Him, really.
They really are a vestige, is the word that Bonaventure used, and they are to draw our attention up.
And as
to
a
Him.
scientist, for you to go out to the simpler life and see how complex it is, like you say in the beginning, the ecosystem and how fragile it is and how everything connects. Just like the Catholic faith, as you get into it, you realize amazingly how all of these pieces end up sliding together and fitting perfectly. Like a jigsaw puzzle, it's the same thing. You're going out there and seeing, wow, there's this to this to this to this, and if you change this one thing, that disturbs the entire ecosystem. And that's why we have to be careful sometimes in the church. We think, well, this is wonderful. Let me just tweak this one thing over here. And as you know from being a Protestant minister, how quickly that can unravel things, right?
And so part of the book is, and some would say, how does this book fit in with all the others? All of them have one key theme, which is a part of my heart. How do I help someone grow closer to Jesus Christ and understand what following Jesus Christ truly means? And I believe that God, as has been said many times, there's nothing in this book that's brand new. I mean, it's maybe said differently, but God gave us two books. You know, through we have the Word, the Scriptures, as a part of sacred tradition, but we also have the book of this world, in which He's trying to communicate to us. And as it says in the book of Romans, you can't not see it, the evidence of God in creation, if you look. But we live in a world where our technological progress pulls us so forward, so fast, that we're not seeing the evidence of God around us. And it's right there. And part of the goal is, how do we ourselves recognize the love of God for us in the world? How do we help our kids see it?
Right. Now, you mentioned in this book you're a voracious reader, and you mentioned Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ. A lot of people have heard of that. But this one, everybody knows the late, great Father Thomas Dubay. He was a good friend of ours here at the network. I'm sure you had lunch and dinner with him many, many times.
My biggest disappointment is I didn't spend more time with him.
What a wonderful man. But a book I'm not as familiar with, Happy Are You Poor?
Oh, get it and read it.
Yeah.
I'd say it's one of the most challenging books I've read. He takes, I'm not sure when this will be broadcast, but recently our gospel readings last week were all about, unless you denounce your possessions, you cannot be my disciple. You know, hating our parents and mothers and our wife and children. What's this got to do with things? About the guy that was invited to the wedding feast but said, I can't come, I got property, I got a wife. Wait a second, how do you live that? And most of us ignore those. I mean, denying our possessions. Oh, that's for the nuns that live out there by themselves. That's not for me. Wait a second. Father Dubay's book is no, this is about us. So how do we live it? And the beauty of his book is that he recognizes that there are different levels of calling. If you're a priest or religious or you're married or you're celibate, that Christ's call to detachment is different for us. So, but how do you do it? How do you live it? In many ways, what I've tried to do in this book is help a regular folk like you or me, Doug. Although you're much unregular than I am.
Test.
You're high test.
People will attest to here.
But how do we live this out? I mean, because we will stand before our Lord, as it says, for how we've lived this life.
Now, weed 'em and reap. Now, when I first started, I thought, did Scott Hahn write the titles here, or you just been hanging out with him, or Jeff Cavins or something?
No.
Weed 'em and reap. But you say that's the unofficial name of your 25 acres. Do you still call it that?
Yeah, we call it weed 'em and reap, because it's exactly true. We might get something if we ever weeded our land, but our biggest, as I mentioned there, our biggest, most pervasive crop are wild raspberries, in other words, briars. We're not a farm that plants things. It's mostly either woods or grazing land. We usually do have a big garden. We got chickens now.
Yeah, well, you said, I think, Maryland strawberries or...
She did strawberries one year, and they were the best crop we've ever had on the property.
Now you haven't created any inexplicable 50-foot-long dents on the farmland as you did in your prior work in the fields as a youth.
Yeah, I mean, that was just basically saying, look, it isn't in my blood or genes to be a good farmer. I remember once...
You'd rather play baseball, right?
When I was a kid, I was all ambitious. I was going to put a garden in our backyard, and I got the rototiller out and plowed one long swath. And then when I went to turn around, my friend reminded me I got baseball practice. Well, I never did one more thing. We had that swath in that yard forever. And if you go there today, you can see a little dent. And my point is, part of what I talk about in here is the simple life, the rural life. Farming is an absolutely beautiful thing. But it isn't necessarily simple for everybody. And there are people, in fact, I think Devin Rose, for example, wrote a book about... He tried it and it didn't work, going back to the farm. But the aspects of the gospel of simplicity and detachment are important for everyone, and we need to learn that.
Well, I think sometimes we like, the old grass is always greener kind of a thing, and even the simpler times. Yeah, there are certain aspects of it that were simpler. There's also other parts of it that are more complicated. You know what I mean? When it's simpler, but there's no modern conveniences. There's other things that are difficult. So life is always a trade-off. You know what I mean? In one way or the other, living on the farm versus living in the city. There are advantages and disadvantages. And at the end of the day, I think what Dubé was saying, what you're referring to as well, is the idea that you can be detached anywhere you are, and you can be attached anywhere you are. Yep. You can be out there living, you know, on the farm in the most rural kind of, and be totally attached to the world.
Well, and overrun with responsibilities.
Right.
A farmer, I've come to see the farmer as it has to be one of the most intelligent men in our culture, because they have to know so much.
And you were once known as an outstanding man in your field,
well,
too, right? Is that the farmer's joke there?
Yeah, when I grew up, my dad said that a farmer was a man outstanding in his field. You know, well, it's a whole lot more than that. You know, and it involves animal husbandry. It involves knowing the soil, knowing the weather, chemistry, being very self-disciplined. You know, when and I have a story in there about trying to save one of my cattle that was frozen to the ground into the middle of a snowstorm. No one was over my shoulder telling me I had to do that. I had to be self-motivated to go out and take care of this farm. That's a big part of farm work.
Right. Well, you say here that years ago, in a section called Look at the Birds, years ago I dabbled for a time in scientific materialism, because you talk about having a scientific bent, and that's what your background was. Yet one of the things that helped me see the inadequacy of this mindset was the miracle of birds, particularly the fact that each species has a unique song. That's an interesting insight.
Again, I don't know if I was sitting here with a Darwinist and whether I'd win the argument or not, but so often evolutionists, Darwinian evolutionists, want to explain everything about us through natural selection, survival of the fittest, mutations in genes. Okay, well, that might explain why, if in fact there is a difference between this horse and that horse, or this dog and that dog. But the fact that that every yellow warbler has the exact same call, no matter where it is in the world. Why? You can't explain it with genes or evolution. To me, I see that's the humor of our God giving this wonderful creature this unique call for us to hear and then recognize that's a sign of God's love and rejoice in that. And most of creation, I think, was given to us for that, rejoicing in almost the humor of God giving us this wonderful environment to take care of, to enjoy, temporarily.
And Christ talks
We're
about
a pilgrimage.
Also in the Gospels, obviously.
This book is many ways taking Christ's lead to look at nature and look at then examples of metaphors for our life.
Extending you one day, look at the birds, the field. Then you say, with the desire to help the alienated, one comes closer to rapturous union. I've often preached on this parable. What kind of soil are you? Because you're talking about soil, you're talking about farming. What rocks or weeds pollute your life and rob you of the nourishment of God's word? And that's wherever you live and wherever you are. Right? What are the things that are impacting or stopping you from living the life you know you're called to live?
Yeah, in the middle of the book, when the book progresses through, it's kind of a layman's approach to Bonaventure's Journey of the Mind of God in many ways, but in the book particularly, I look at the fact how we're caught in the soup of our culture, the soup of the idea of progress, and the point is, to a certain extent, the first big step, I think, is just recognizing to what extent our lives have become enslaved by our progressive culture. We just do whatever our culture wants. And to a certain extent, our technological culture has so moved us forward. In the process, it's taken away many previous options. A good example of that is my little town. 80% of the stores are closed. They're all mom and pop stores. Well, they're all gone because the big supermarkets put them out of business. Because now, instead of going to 8 little stores that were all local families, we can go to this one big store and get everything, right? So they can't. So if you're a young family and you decide, I want to start a business selling shoes, well, they can't do it because they can't compete. Right. But the problem is that now even those big stores can't compete because the internet is providing everything quicker. So I've got a friend now that owns a Catholic bookstore who's on the verge of bankruptcy, because what happens is good Catholics go into a store, pick a book off the shelf, like it, but while they're standing there, they take their iPhone and order it
right.
off the internet.
Right.
So, how do we move backwards?
Right.
And the church calls us to that, calls us to a thing called subsidiarity,
Right.
to look for ways that we can support our local family, our community. That's what a lot of this is about. How do we preserve our culture, preserve our families in the midst of a soup that pulls us so far forward that we just buy into every new technology, not because it's better, but because it's quicker and it's easier.
Right.
Not because it's better.
Right.
And how do we slow down without rejecting it all and realizing that there's gifts of God?
Right, because we have to engage in that. Otherwise, we have.
I mean, here you and I are doing TV.
Right.
So how do we control our families, control our lives?
This is the question, really. I mean, I'm reading through the whole book. The one question that really came to me was, who is Bungie, and is he still with you?
He's not.
Okay.
Actually, poor old Bungie. He was one of our good dogs, and I love animals, and one of our wonderful pets, and he eventually bit the dust out there on the farm. We've had a lot of our animals, and I was just talking to one of our good friends here that works here about how almost all of us in our culture, when you lived on the farm, you lived a rural life, you were more used to death. You were more used to seeing life come and go on a farm. And we've been protected from it now. Although, on the other hand, how many of us think we've seen 100 people die? Well, we haven't. We've seen people act like they're dying in movies and TV.
Or we've seen video on the web or on news reports of seeing the carnage.
But my boys have grown up with, I've birthed cows and sheep, and my boys have done that. We've killed our chickens, and they've seen all aspects of life. I think it's really helped them appreciate this.
Well, it puts your life in context too,
Yeah.
and to realize what a gift it is, and that it can be so quickly taken away. The thin red line, as they would say. Now, talking in rural life, in that chapter, you have a couple of points you make: meditate daily on the New Testament, look more closely at your stuff, etc. But this is the one that struck me here, that you point out. You say, recognize that even if we believe that our present accumulation of stuff is not harmful to our spiritual life, it might be setting an unsustainable example for our children and grandchildren. By grace, we might have become sufficiently detached from our stuff. We might have convinced ourselves that if we lost it all tomorrow, we would be just fine. We might have to quit buying more and more and have become content with living more simply. The question arises whether it's necessary to continue divesting ourselves of the remaining stuff that surrounds us. So it's interesting too, because in thinking about it, that one could see themselves doing that, or I can add these things on, but I can feel detached. But what is that message I'm giving my kids or my grandkids?
Yeah, you look in any community, and you can almost guarantee almost every community around us, one of the most common new structures in new communities are these self-storage units.
Right.
They're everywhere because of stuff.
Got to put our stuff someplace.
More stuff.
Right.
We got more stuff. We're paying money to store our stuff.
Right.
And as in that chapter, which I deal with St. Aquinas' view of the rural life, he defines the fact that there are bodily needs that you and I need, even to grow spiritually. We need food, water, shelter, and clothing. We need that. But the beauty of those things is that there's a natural limit. You and I can only eat so much, though. I tend to eat more as I get older, it seems.
Me too.
But we eat, but anything beyond that are not necessary. And the material goods that are not necessary have no natural limit. And so that's why in our culture that's really focused more on the material goods as opposed to the bodily goods. You can never have enough.
Right, and that's the point. And that's why people keep acquiring, because the reality is once you get it, the satiation disappears fairly quickly, and so you put that's now your stuff. And now you got to get something else new, because otherwise, why am I working? Why am I living? Where's my next new thing? And like you said, I got to find it. George Carlin years ago, the comedian, did a whole routine about, got to find a place for my stuff. I got my stuff. Where am I going to put my stuff?
I know you almost hate to recommend it, but it was true. I mean, he was just so exactly right. And And Brad Gregory, in his wonderful book, The Unfinished Reformation, or The Unintended Reformation, makes a comment about part of this, what's in us is that we have this desire. We're not happy until we get something. But once we get it, we're unhappy because we got to have more. We got to have the next. And we have a culture that is based on that truth, makes money on that truth, assuming that's the way we think. And we're on this escalator, getting more and more stuff. And the point of that quote was, even if you and I decide, okay, spiritually, I don't want any more. I'm not going to buy any more junk. I'm simplifying. But at the level at which we stopped, we're already setting a bad example for our kids. And how are they going to, you know how it is, the kids are taught that to be successful, they got to do better than their parents.
Well, you start where your parents were.
Yeah, so they get more stuff, then more stuff. When are we going to stop? And it's got to stop with us. Somehow we have to set a better example for our kids so that when you and I are 80 or 90, we're not a burden on our kids. Hopefully we're a blessing on our kids. Because they're the ones that are going to be deciding whether to put you and I in a nursing home or where they're going to take care of us.
Well, they need to do that because otherwise they'll have to sell some of their stuff to take care of you, and they don't want to do that. Well, thank you so much, Marcus, for stopping by. Always great to talk with you and see you. And you're doing a great job with the journey home. Marcus Grodi, Life from Our Land, The Search for a Simpler Life in a Complex World, published by Ignatius Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. As always, everything he writes is definitely worth purchasing through the EWTNRC.com website. Thanks for joining us here on EWTN's Bookmark.